That. Also, it was really funny, just real fast. I was listening, still in our car, in Abby's car, we still have, David, you might appreciate this, because it's kind of like a dad joke. Or I should say a grandpa joke now. I was listening to Little Drummer Boy, because we still have Christmas music in the car. It's just the CD for King and Country. And for some reason, every time, I always like Little Drummer Boy, because I always like to say parum-pa-pum-pum. And then it finally dawned on me, that's how they named the Nevadan town. Parum-pa-pum-pum. You're welcome. Now there's a new joke for you to tell. All right? Just trying to help you out here. Parum-pa-pum-pum. See? There you go. There you go.
We won't say it in church.
Yeah. Kim Rose went to, so we won't go there either.
Amar, are we good? All right, let me pray and let's begin. Dear Lord, thank you for this time that we're able to learn about your word. I just ask that you help us understand the history of Israel at this time, and that we are able to use it to see how you have just made a wonderful story leading up to your Son, our Messiah, and our Savior, Lord. And I just ask that we understand it, that we're able to take these lessons and apply them. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right, so last week we did the first 8 kings of Israel, which remember is the northern kingdom, not the southern kingdom. So the northern kingdom, we went from Jeroboam to, oh goodness, what was the last king? Ahaziah. We went from Jeroboam to Ahaziah. So this time we're going to go from Joram to Hoshea, although Joram is sometimes called Jehoram. It's one of the people that has multiple names in the Bible, depending on how it's spelled and such like that. So we're picking up this story with the history of the northern kingdom of Israel. As I said, King Ahaziah, we left off with him. He just died. And we also ended with the beginning of the ministry of Elisha, so we're also picking up on this. So the next king, as I said, is Jehoram or Joram. Joram is how you spell his other name. And the start of his reign discusses how Moab rebels after the death of Ahab, which was his father. So Jehoram and Ahaziah, they were not father and son, they were actually brothers. Okay, they were both sons of Ahab. And Ahaziah dies, and so his brother Jehoram takes the throne. Now, the king of Moab, he rebels. He used to pay Israel tribute, he used to give King Ahab money. But once Ahab dies, he stops. So Jehoram gathers the king of Edom and also King Jehoshaphat of Judah, and the three of them go up to fight against Moab and their king. And as you can see, he defeats the king. But first, to do that, they actually ask Elisha if God will grant them the victory and what they should do. And so Elisha has them actually build trenches where the battle is to take place, and to kind of, just build trenches. And then the Lord somehow fills it with water. I can't remember exactly. I didn't put it in my notes, but the Lord kind of fills it with water. I can't remember. I think there might have been a rain or something, or some type of flood. And so the Moabites, when they're heading in, they actually see it, and they see the reflection of the sun right off this water, and then of course with the ground and dirt and everything. And so they actually think it's blood. And so they think that the three kings, right, Edom's king, King Jehoshaphat of Judah, and then King Jehoram, they think that they fought against each other, and so they actually rush in to gather what they think would be the spoils. And so they're going to take all this stuff, and they realize that they're mistaken, and instead the three kings then attack them and defeat the king of Moab. And so that is how the king of Moab was defeated. And so that's the introduction story to Jehoram right after the beginning of Elisha's ministry, where he curses the children and the mama bears come out and maul them. And then you have this short story of Jehoram with Elisha as well. And then from chapters 4 to 8 in 2 Kings, this is where the story of Elisha is mainly told now. And Jehoram will come back through those chapters and at the end. So now we're going to talk about Elisha and mainly his ministry. Okay, and again, this is chapters 2 Kings 4 through 8. And the story that we just did is 2 Kings 3. So we're following along in 2 Kings. So this section with Elisha, it begins with a miracle of unending oil again until there's enough to sell, to pay this debt of a widow that Elisha knew. He knows this widow and her late husband, and they both feared the Lord. And so Elisha helps the widow then in a very difficult time. And this is very similar to a lot of the other miracles that you see, like Elijah with the never-ending oil, with the widow there as well. So you kind of see this comparison with this widow and unending oil that they fill these jars of so they can go and sell, and then they pay off this debt that they have. And then it moves to Elisha helping another woman, a Shunammite woman, who had her husband actually make a room for Elisha in their home so he could stay there when he came and visited. And so Elisha was grateful for this kindness, and he asks his servant what might be done for her. And his servant is Gehazi, that's Elisha's servant, and he tells Elisha that the Shunammite woman doesn't have a son. She doesn't have any children, so Elisha lets her know then that she is going to bear a son within the year. And of course, this is a great thing for the woman. And the child is born, and she absolutely, like any mother, loves her child. And it immediately goes, and it says sometime later, or something along those lines, it says sometime later, when the boy is growing up, his head hurts. It doesn't say why his head hurts, but it says his head hurts, and he dies. And so the woman, the Shunammite woman, immediately saddles her mount and goes and finds Elisha and has him come. And Elisha comes to her aid, of course, and he heals the boy by lying himself upon him, and he, like Elijah, raises the boy from the dead. And Elisha is the second person in the Bible to perform a miracle like this. And we talked a little bit about that last time when we were talking about Elijah. Right? The only two Old Testament prophets that ever did it was Elijah and Elisha. The only two New Testament prophets, apostles that we know of that did it was Peter and Paul, outside of Jesus, of course. So this really does show how Elisha really did get that double portion of the spirit of Elijah. So you can really see how Elisha and Elijah are two very prominent prophets just through the miracles that they do. In fact, a lot of the other prophets don't do the miracles that Elijah and Elisha do. They do sometimes do certain things, but many of them is really about giving revelation, not necessarily about miracles as well. And it's rather fascinating to me for that, because a lot of the other prophets, they're given books in the Bible, right? And they give revelation, not that Elisha and Elijah don't, but Elisha and Elijah are known as well, right, very well known as miracle workers, and yet they don't even have a book in the Bible. So it's rather a fascinating thing to me. But clearly they're very important in the story of Israel. But after this, we have Elisha at Gilgal. He goes to Gilgal, and some of the people there are making stew, and they accidentally grab this poisonous plant and they put it into the pot. And the people are eating it, and then they realize what's in the pot. They realize that there's a poisonous plant in the stew, and they've eaten it, which is not good. And so they cry out to Elisha, and he throws meal or powder into the pot, and it fixes the stew, and everyone is then allowed to eat it. And then Elisha seems to do another miracle at another place to make more food out of, or not at another place, I'm sorry. But he seems to make more food out of nowhere. Again, kind of just like the oil with the widow, with what he did earlier, as well as Elijah. And so both this miracle and the oil miracle are very similar, as I said, to Elijah's. But it also kind of seems to be a picture of Jesus' miracle of feeding the thousands of people with the loaves of fish and the bread. It seems to be kind of along those lines of just kind of food appearing or unending. It kind of seems to be one of those types of miracles as well. So now in chapter 5, you continue on with his story, and you get a very famous story with this one. This is the healing of Naaman, who's the captain of the army of Aram or Syria. And at that time, Syria and Israel do not have the best relationship. Remember when I was saying how Syria, sometimes they're in league with Israel, and then sometimes they're attacking each other. This is one of the times when they're attacking each other. They don't have a good relationship at this time. And so Naaman is the captain of the army of Syria, and he goes to, Naaman comes down and he goes to Elisha to be healed. And Elisha is actually willing to heal Naaman, but he sends him off, if you remember the story, to the Jordan River to wash himself to be healed. And at first, Naaman doesn't want to do this. But his men persuade him to obey Elisha. And so Naaman washes himself and he is healed. And so then he goes back to Elisha to reward him, wants to give him something. But Elisha refuses to take anything. He doesn't want to take anything. And so Naaman and his men leave, and then Elisha's servant Gehazi becomes greedy, and he goes out to them as they're leaving, and he lies about having guests arrive, and Naaman then gives him gifts. And Gehazi, he takes these gifts and he hides them, and then he goes back to Elisha, but the Lord shows Elisha what his servant has done, and Elisha tells Gehazi, his servant, that he and his descendants will now have leprosy. So it kind of seems like the leprosy that was on Naaman is now upon Gehazi and his descendants. That's kind of what it seems like, to a certain degree. So that is the story of Naaman. Again, really fascinating story because he's a Syrian and he comes to an Israelite to be healed, and Israel and Syria don't have a good relationship, and yet the Lord is willing to heal Naaman of his leprosy. Now the next story is also rather famous. I remember growing it up and hearing about it, is the story of Elisha helping this man retrieve an axe head that he has borrowed. So he borrowed an axe, and they're cutting down and they're chopping up stuff, and the axe head flies off and it goes into a river. It goes into some water, and the man is obviously distressed, not only because it's an axe head, right, but it's also borrowed, so it's not his. And so he asks Elijah, and Elisha throws a stick into the water, and then the axe head comes to the top. And so it floats there, and so the person is able to grab it and take it, and everything is fixed. And then we immediately move to how the Syrians kept trying to attack Israel, but Elisha keeps telling the king of Israel where the Syrians are going to be camped, so that way they can avoid the Syrians. And so Elisha keeps the king alive and the Israelites safe. And so the Syrians, the king of Syria, really isn't happy about it, and he asks, right, his supervisors what's going on, and they let him know that, you know, they have a prophet there who's kind of avoiding us and telling the king, excuse me, to avoid us. And so the Syrian king is not very happy. So he has his men go and capture Elisha. So they go to where Elisha is, and they arrive at his house, and they're completely surrounding his house, but they themselves are surrounded by a legion of angels. And Elisha, he can see the angels, and he is unafraid. But Elisha's servant, and it doesn't say if this is Gehazi or not, but Gehazi does show up later, so it could be Gehazi, even though he has leprosy, but it's kind of interesting because it just says his servant this time. It doesn't say Gehazi, so I don't really know if it's still Gehazi or not. But either way, Elisha's servant doesn't see them, and he is afraid. All he sees is the Syrian army. He doesn't see the angels, and so he's obviously quaking in his boots. But then Elisha asks God to open up his servant's eyes, and God grants this, and the servant is able to see the angels surrounding the Syrian army that's trying to take Elisha. And then, I like this part. Elisha prays for God to then blind the Syrians, and God does this for him. And then Elisha basically just goes out, and he leads the Syrian army to the king of Israel. And they're basically captured without being captured. Right? Because then they're basically surrounded by the army of Israel. And the king of Israel asks Elisha, what should I do with them? Should I kill them? What should I do? And Elisha's like, no, just feed them and let them go. And so that's what the king of Israel does. He feeds them, and then he lets them go. And so they go back up to Syria. And it's interesting because at the end of this section, it says that the Syrians then do not attack Israel again. And that's how the section ends. But then the very next section says that Syria is attacking Israel. So there's a couple of ways this could work, is that it's this group of Syrians seems to kind of be like marauders. And so it could just be referring to that kind of group of Syrians, or it could be the fact that time has taken place in between and that there's now a new king. And so now that king with the Syrian army that he has is now going and attacking Israel again. So those are the two ways that it's kind of, from my understanding, how it's seen. Okay, so if you're reading this section in 2 Kings, just be aware of that it could either be a different king or it's that group of Assyrians, the marauders, that is now not attacking Israel. And I would imagine it's a new king because right after it does say that Ben-Hadad is the king of Syria, so it kind of assumes that it's now a different king. So, and Assyria is attacking Israel again. But either way, when this either new group or the new king is attacking Israel this time, there happens to be a famine in the land. And this is still part of Elisha, and this is still part of Jehoram. Okay, so this is still in with Elisha and Jehoram. And there's this famine in Israel, and it gets so bad that they actually resort to cannibalism. And there's a really sad story of this mother killing her children and eating the child, and then getting upset with another mother who's not actually willing to do it to her child when they had made a pact to actually do this. And they bring it before the king, and the king is obviously very distraught about this, and he blames Elisha. And it doesn't necessarily say why, but it could be kind of like how Elijah predicted the famine, and so Elisha predicted the famine. And so the king sends men to the prophet, and the prophet tells the messenger that by the next day there's going to be food. So everything's going to be fine. But in about 24 hours, you're going to have food. It's going to be okay. But the messenger, if you read the story, is rather rude to Elisha. It seems to me anyway. And it also seems that he doesn't truly believe what Elisha is saying. And so Elisha then tells that man that these things aren't really going to happen, and he's actually going to see it happen, but he's not going to taste of the food. So he basically tells the messenger, and you find this out a little bit later, that he's going to die the next day. In a sense, that's really what he's predicting. Whether the man actually understood what Elisha was saying, that's a different story. But Elisha prophesies that the man's going to die the next day. And that's exactly what does happen. So the story that is presented is that there's these 4 lepers. So the next day, there's these 4 lepers that decide to go to the Syrian army's camp. That's camped a little bit away. And they do this because they think there's really nothing better for them anyway, because they're either going to starve in Israel, they're either going to be killed by the Syrians, or the Syrians are going to grant them mercy. Right? It really can't get any. It can't really get any worse for them, basically, because they either starve to death in Israel, or they're going to live and then Syrians going to attack and then they would die, or they can go to the Syrian army and they're going to kill them, which they would die anyway of starvation, or maybe the Syrians will actually just give them food and grant them mercy. They have leprosy anyway, so nothing can really get that much worse. So they decide to go to the Syrian army camp. And when they get there, it's completely deserted. And the author of 2 Kings lets the readers know that it's because the Lord had caused a great noise that made the Syrians think that they were being attacked by the Hittites and the Egyptians. They think that the king of Israel has hired the Hittites and the Egyptians to come out and fight them. And so they get really, really scared. And so they run away, and they don't pack anything. They just leave all of their stuff there. All of the food, all the spoil, and they just run away. And so the lepers see this, and instead of taking everything, they do the right thing and they go back to the city and they tell the other Israelites. And so the king hears of this, and so he then sends some people out to check on the lepers' story, right? Because he doesn't want to send everyone because the lepers are lying or if something's happened, you don't want everyone to die. So he sends out a little bit of a group, and they see exact same thing that the lepers have. They come back, they corroborate the story, and then all the people go and collect the spoils of the Syrian army. And that would include, of course, the food. Now, during that time, when the people are flocking to the camp, right, when there's that massive horde of people all running like it's a Black Friday sale, they actually trample the officer that didn't believe what Elisha had said and was rather rude to him. And so the prophecy of Elisha comes true. And it says that he dies and was trampled at the gate in the town. When they're leaving, apparently he was trampled to death. And so that is the story of how God saves Israel during the famine and how the prophecy of Elisha comes true about that messenger. Now we get to the next story, which also does happen around the same time as the famine, just after it actually. It's a story again of the Shunammite woman. So during the famine, Elisha tells the Shunammite woman to actually flee during that time, to actually leave. And she does. And now she's returning after 7 years, and she's trying to get her land back. And so she appeals to the king of Israel, and the king learns who she is and what Elisha has done for her. And so the king then gives back the land to the Shunammite woman and her husband. I have no idea. Magic, Dana. So anyway, that's the story of the Shunammite woman getting back her land from the king. Now, the next two stories of Elisha are about succession of kings, and this is in 2 Kings chapter 8 and 9. So the next part that you find is Elisha is telling Hazael, who's a high officer of the king of Syria, that he's actually going to be the next king of Syria. And he also knows that Hazael is going to do a lot of evil against the Israelites. And Elisha is actually very sad about this because the Lord reveals this to him and what Hazael is going to do. And Hazael actually murders Ben-Hadad and becomes the king of Syria. And then Elisha tells Jehu, who's the captain of the Israelite army, that he's going to be the next king of Israel. So he tells Hazael he's going to be the next king of Syria, and then he tells Jehu that he's going to be the next king of Israel. And not only is he going to be the next king, he's also going to kill the rest of the house of Ahab according to the Lord's prophecy. Right? If you remember, the Lord prophesied against Ahab that his house is going to be like Jeroboam and Baasha, and that they're all going to be destroyed. And that's what Jehu actually does. He fulfills the prophecy. He kills Jehoram. He also has Jezebel killed, because Jezebel was still alive at this time. He has her killed. And he kills all the sons and the children of Ahab, kills all his descendants, and he even kills Ahaziah, the king of Judah, during this time. So not only does he kill the king of Israel, he also kills the king of Judah. And Jehu also kills the worshipers and the priests of Baal. So he's completely annihilating everyone that is with Ahab, or basically in accordance with Ahab and his household. He's completely killing all of them, according to what God actually asked him to do. So this isn't going against what God wanted. God actually told Jehu to do this, right? And this is judgment on Ahab and his household. And so Jehu actually begins his reign rather well, doing exactly what God has asked him to do. He's delivering justice to Israel, right? He does what God commands him, and he destroys the house of Ahab. He destroys Ahab's evil. He kills the priests of Baal. He eradicates that evil out of Israel. So he starts very well. However, Jehu does not keep in following in the Lord. Nor does he take down the golden calves that Jeroboam had first set up. But the Lord, in his grace, does allow Jehu to reign and his descendants to reign up to the 4th generation. He tells Jehu this. But again, Jehu's heart is not with the Lord, and it's during this time that some of Israel began to be taken again by Syria. So during Jehu's reign, some of Israel's land is starting to be taken by Syria. Jehu starts off well. Unfortunately, he does not end well. All right? And so then you get to his son, Jehoahaz. Oh, and by the way, Jehu reigned for 28 years. I forgot to mention that. Jehu reigns for 28 years. So he has a pretty good time of reigning. But after that, you have Jehoahaz. He reigns, and he is the 11th king of Israel. And Jehoahaz, he does not follow the Lord at all. He commits evil. He commits idolatry. He follows after Jeroboam, right, the first king of Israel. And during his reign, portions of the land of Israel is again taken by Syria, but not all of them. All right. Jehoahaz actually does entreat the Lord for favor, and the Lord does grant this. So Israel is saved from Syria. Syria does not conquer all of Israel. Syria had been oppressing Israel, but God grants salvation to them where Syria stops. However, Israel does keep sinning, and they do become weaker than they have been, of course. And their army is getting pretty well depleted due to Syria's attacks. And so the king of Israel, Jehoahaz, he dies after reigning for 17 years. All right? And then you have his son Jehoash, or Joash. And Jehoash is the 12th king of Israel. And he reigns for 16 years, and he, of course, also does much evil in the sight of the Lord. If you haven't picked up on it yet, all of the kings of Israel, and I said this last week, all the kings of Israel do bad. There's not a good king of Israel. They all are doing evil.
Going back to Jehu, who slaughtered everyone, he seems to do it not out of spirit-led sort of thing. He's just doing it because he likes the power.
Somewhat. Some of it, I think, is from what Elisha tells him, but I would say eventually it probably does get into some of that line.
The way I read it, it seems like that he gets so excited about it. It's not like King David, who waits for the Lord to give him the kingdom.
Yeah.
Right? And he's like, great, that's permission. I'll just do it myself. And he just goes on a slaughter. Anyway, just to prove out, because you were just mentioning that all of them were evil, but it sounded like Jehu was good.
Well, he's the only one, as far as I know, he's the only one that kind of starts off good and then ends evil in Israel. But he's not necessarily seen in a good light, but he is in a sense, because he actually took out Ahab's household and killed all of the worshipers and priests of Baal, according to the word of the Lord. So religiously speaking, he comes off as good at the beginning, but then, of course, he ends bad, just like all of them. But anyway, so his grandson, Jehoash, he becomes king, reigns for 16 years. He also does much evil. But with some of the things that he does do is he does protect Israel from Syria, and he does take back some of their cities. So Syria had taken some of the cities, and so Jehoash actually goes and takes them back. And he does this 3 times, and this is from a prophecy that Elisha gives him, granting Jehoash a gift. So Elisha gives the king these arrows, and this is when Elisha is dying. And so Elisha tells King Jehoash to take these arrows and to strike the ground. Right? And so Jehoash does it, and he strikes the ground 3 times. And that's how many times he will defeat Syria. However, Elisha tells him he should have hit the ground more times, like 5 or 6 times. That way he would have completely destroyed or defeated Syria. But because he only hit the ground 3 times, then he's only going to defeat Syria 3 times. And that's exactly what happens. So he defeats Syria 3 times, and he does protect Israel, which is a very good thing. And as I said, during Jehoash's reign, this is when Elisha dies, and he's buried. And then you have this really fun little story. So when this group of people, this group of, I think Israelites are burying their friend, there's a group of marauding Moabites that are coming. And so they flee, and they kind of just put their dead friend in Elisha's tomb. I don't know if they knew whose tomb it was, but they basically just kind of throw their friend into a tomb. And apparently on Elisha's bones, so not only just in the tomb, but actually on Elisha himself. And it doesn't say, right, if this is on purpose or on accident, but when the dead man actually touches the bones of Elisha, he comes back to life. And then he gets up, and then, he goes out with his friends, who are probably really confused at what just happened. But anyway, that's a fun little story in the middle of the narrative of 2 Kings. What? Yeah, I don't know. It's rather interesting. I mean, Elisha's the only one that I know who's been dead and literally raised a person back to life. I mean, that's pretty incredible right there. Granted, obviously, this is God doing it, but it's still a fun little story just in the middle of the narrative. You get Elisha, he's dead, and then his bones, can cause a miracle. Kind of like when in the New Testament, people wanted to be like Paul's shadow, or touch the handkerchief, they think they get, healed. Or the woman, right, who touches Jesus' cloak. It's kind of like that kind of idea. But anyway, I've always thought that was a really fun story, and so it's in the middle of this. So continuing on with Jehoash, there we go. He also defends himself against Amaziah, who's the king of Judah at this time. And Amaziah attacks Jehoash basically for no reason. The king of Judah seems to kind of get a big head because he had defeated a couple other people, I think defended himself. And so he thinks he can then defeat Israel in battle. And so he challenges, literally sends people to challenge Jehoash to come meet so they can fight. And Jehoash actually tries to say, why do we need to do this? This is ridiculous. We don't need to fight. There's nothing to fight over. But Amaziah doesn't like that idea, so he goes out to fight him, and Jehoash defeats him. And not only does he defeat him, he captures Amaziah. He also captures other people of Judah. He tears down some of the wall of Jerusalem, and he takes some of the treasures in the city as well. So not only did he defeat Amaziah, he did some other things as well that weakened Jerusalem and Judah. And so that's everything that happens during Jehoash's reign in 2 Kings. And then after him comes Jeroboam II, who is his son. And Jeroboam, again, also does evil. But as Jehoash does, he does restore some of their land back. And he also sets up and defends their borders, which apparently was prophesied by Jonah. This is actually a really interesting thing. So in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 25, you get the mention of Jonah. Same Jonah who was swallowed by a big fish. I like to think goldfish because no one can tell me that's not true. So 2 Kings 14:25, during Jeroboam's reign, it says that he restored the border of Israel from the entrance of Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai the prophet, who was of Gath-Hepher. And so that's a really interesting thing that, because usually when you think of Jonah, he's only going to Nineveh, but he clearly has other things that he revealed as well. It's just not in his book. And as far as I know, that part is not in his book. But anyway, yeah, it references Jonah at this time. So if you're thinking of when did Jonah happen, right? When did Jonah live? He at least was alive during Jeroboam's the second time, and obviously before if he was doing some prophecies. So that is a good indicating of when Jonah would be alive, if in case you were wondering. But that's an interesting thing that I found out. And it's also during Jeroboam II's reign that the author then lets the readers know that God will not completely destroy Israel. And he actually uses Jeroboam to save them. However, he still, of course, doesn't like the evil that the Israelites are committing. Jeroboam II reigns for 41 years, for a very long time, actually. He has a really, really long reign. But it's really interesting because you see all these evil kings, and they keep doing really, really bad things, and yet God is still gracious to the Israelites. He's still showing mercy. He's using these kings who are evil to protect his people. And so you see throughout all of this, even though it's a history of Israel, it's really a history of how God is still working in Israel and is still protecting them and is still being gracious to them and is, being patient with them so they'll actually return to him. They never do, unfortunately, right, at this time, but you still do see that throughout all of this history. And that really is an amazing thing. It's why one of the things I teach, and I did it last semester, is when you're talking about Genesis 1, right, and it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, it lets you know right off the bat that this entire book is really about God. The Bible is all about God. The main story, the main character in every single story is really God, and God using that person for his purposes. And we need to remember that. And so it's always really neat when the author reminds you of that through these stories, saying Jeroboam's a really bad guy, and yet God is still saving Israel. God is still using this person to protect his people, even though they're sinning against him. And so, anyway, that is what is happening, or that's what happened during Jeroboam II's reign, during the 41 years that he was on the throne. And then you have his son, Zechariah. Zechariah is the 14th king of Israel. He reigns in his father stead. And if you're keeping count, this is Jehu's 4th generation. So this is the last line that's going to reign under Jehu. And Zechariah does so much evil, and he follows after both the Jeroboams. He is killed after 6 months of being on the throne. So he only reigns for 6 months. And a man named Shallum, the son of Jabesh, conspires against him and kills him. Yet Shallum reigns even less than Zechariah, because he only reigns 1 month before Menahem assassinates him and becomes king. So in this short amount of time, I believe in 2 Kings 15, you have the two shortest reigns, I believe it's the 2 shortest reigns in all of Israel's history. You have Zechariah, who reigns 6 months, and he's assassinated, and then the man who assassinates him is also immediately assassinated after 1 month. So you have the 14th and 15th king in a span of 7 months. All right, less than a year, and you already go through 2 kings of Israel. All right. Now, Menahem, who kills Shallum, are you guys done writing this down? You guys are? Okay. So Menahem, he's the 16th king, and he also does evil, so much so that it even says that he was killing pregnant women. He does not follow the Lord, but instead he follows after the path of the first king of Israel. He also gives tribute to Assyria during his reign, so that they would not attack Israel and conquer it. So he's paying off Assyria with the money that he had. But as you can see, Israel is just really going downhill. Okay, in the span of less than a year, you have 3 kings. All right, and it's not going to last that much longer. Menahem reigns for about 10 years, or until around 742 BC, which is about 20 years before Israel is conquered by Assyria. All right, and so that's Menahem. All right, and then you get his son Pekahiah. Pekahiah is the 17th king, and he only reigns for 2 years. Okay, so again, pretty short reign, and he also does a lot of evil. And one of his officers, Pekah, conspires against him and assassinates him, and then he becomes the king of Israel. All right, I'm going to wait on this one. But you don't really know too much about Pekahiah, except that he does a lot of evil, reigns for 2 years, and he also is assassinated. But again, you can clearly see this downhill effect that's happening with Israel. A lot of their reigns are starting to get shorter and shorter. Every now and then, you have like Menahem who reigns for the 10 years, but before that you have just a couple of months. You have a son who only reigns for 2 years. And it doesn't necessarily get too much better. Huh?
Such family love.
Yeah, exactly. Now Pekah, who actually kills him, he's the last one who kind of reigns for a long time. And he's like the second to last king. And he does end up reigning for 20 years. Although some of the, and I'll say this a little bit later as well, but because of some of the timeline that you have and kind of like co-regencies and rivals, it's kind of hard to tell when exactly all these reigned, especially when you're reading the Bible and you know like when all these events happen. It's like, well, how did this king reign for this amount when we know that Israel was conquered at this time and it says he's reigning, and you should also have this king also reigning at the time. So there could have been co-rivals. So some of the people could have been reigning at the same time in different areas, just so you know. At least near the end. So Pekah kills Pekahiah. And it's during Pekah's reign that the king of Syria, Tiglath-Pileser, comes and attacks Israel, and he conquers a lot of the land, including Galilee. So he takes over Galilee. And he also carries away many of the Israelites as captives. All right, so that's really what happens in Pekah's reign. And he reigns for 20 years. So he has a pretty good reign. Again, he could have had a co-rival with him. But this is when Assyria really comes in and conquers a lot of it. Israel is not completely conquered, but it's like hanging on by a thread, basically. All right? And so Pekah, in his 20th year, he is then conspired against, and he's killed by Hoshea, the son of Elah, who becomes the last king of Israel. So Hoshea is the 19th king of Israel. Pekah is the 18th king of Israel. Hoshea, he is the last king. And so in 2 Kings 17, 1 through 6, this is where you find the story of Hoshea in his reign of 9 years. And some of the last kings, like I said, they could have been co-rivals and such. So depending on when you're looking at the timeline, sometimes it's rather difficult to nail down because they could have been reigning, like I said, at different time or at the same time in different areas. But in 2 Kings 17, verses 1 through 6, this is where you get the story of Hoshea. So it says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea the son of Elah became king over Israel in Samaria and reigned 9 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, only not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hoshea became his servant and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, who had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and had offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. So the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried Israel away into exile to Assyria and settled them in Halah and Habor on the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Meads. So that is the story of how Hoshea loses his kingdom and how Israel is fully conquered by Assyria and taken captive. As I said, Hoshea, last king of Israel, this is when Samaria and Israel completely conquered, and it's when the rest of Israel is captive, led into exile. And again, this occurs during Shalmaneser's reign, and actually after. Basically, Shalmaneser, like I said, or as I read, he learns of Hoshea conspiring against him with the king of Egypt. Hoshea is not giving tribute to Assyria. He's not giving them any more money. The Assyrian king doesn't like it, and so he attacks and he defeats Israel. And that's what happens. Now, what continues right after this, the author gives a reason for why this all happens. And that's the rest of chapter 17, basically. In my section, it literally, the first section from verses 1 through 4 says, Hoshea reigns over Israel, or 1 through 5. Verse 6, it says Israel captive. And then from 7 to 23, it says why Israel fell. That's literally how the description in my Bible gives it. And so the author giving us the reason why Israel falls, and it's due, if you can't guess it, of course, to their disobedience to the Lord. They committed evil and atrocities. They worshipped idols. They sacrificed children to false gods. They built for themselves high places, false idols. They served them. And God had sent prophets to warn the Israelites to repent and to turn back to him, right, like Elijah and Elisha, but they refused to do so. Thus, God sent his judgment, which was in accordance with the law that they would have known about, and God has them taken over and sent into exile. And so this is why Israel fell. Okay, not the southern kingdom, although that is actually the same reason, but we're talking about the northern kingdom. This is why the northern kingdom falls. And the northern kingdom, right, their tribes, they never recover like Judah does. Judah comes back, and they're able to rebuild Jerusalem. This is where you get the term Jew from, actually. That's why they're called Jew, because they're from Judah. But the northern kingdoms, the 10 tribes, they don't recover the same way. Obviously, some of the people from the tribes, they still would have existed, but many of them actually intermarried. And they became what was known as the Samaritans in the New Testament. If you didn't know where the Samaritans come from, it is the 10 tribes intermarrying the Gentiles. And so that's where the Samaritans come from. They're half Jewish, and that's why, or they're half Israelite, I should say, and that's why the Jewish people don't really like them, because they're a mixed race. But the 10 tribes, they do come back to their land, and those that were allowed to stay did, and of course, but they all, basically, they were all intermarrying with the people that Assyria had placed in Israel, or the places that they were exiled to. And so that's what happens to the northern tribes of Israel. They disobeyed God, and they were sent into exile. Assyria captured them, they sent them into exile, and they never fully recover. And it's because they did not fear the Lord, and they did not serve him. They were led astray, and they also allowed themselves to disobey God and be led astray and worship the idols. Right? Because you really can't just blame the kings. Okay? Because the people could have done something about it, but they didn't. All right? They chose to be led astray. They chose to worship the false idols. All right? And so that is the history of the Northern Kingdom. Yes.
Bear a greater responsibility.
Yes, the kings do bear a greater responsibility. That is a good point.
Since Jeroboam set up those calves and got rid
Yeah.
of all the real legitimate priests and
Mhm.
the people who would serve them as the Baal worshippers,
Yeah, they do. Yeah, that is a good point. They do share obviously more of the responsibility on that because they were the leaders. But to just blame the kings would not be a correct view as well.
You know, it's a really interesting story that when you read Ezra and Nehemiah and how the southern kingdom returns from their exile in Babylon, how they are punished because they intermarried, right?
Mhm. Yeah, they do the same.
They actually cleanse themselves, divorcing, sending off. It must have been a painful
Yeah.
season. But the northern kingdom never did that.
Nope.
They were guilty, really both sides were guilty of the same thing of intermarrying the new people that came in when God had set them apart for, to be his priests as a holy nation. But it is also, it's got to be disorienting when you probably lose the family allotment by being occupied by a foreign country. I think that would have been very, very disorienting.
Yeah. Well, and Assyria was known for doing that. Babylon was known for doing that. They would take the people, move them, and then take the other people from other lands that they had conquered and then put them in the spot. The only people that were usually left were like the really poor people, or they would leave someone in charge, things of that nature. But yeah, that's what happened. In the northern tribes, they become the Samaritans. And then, of course, you have Dan, which is really interesting because, again, he's not mentioned in the genealogy in Chronicles, and he's also not mentioned at the end in Revelation. And a lot of people think it's due because one of the golden calves was literally in Dan, and they fell so much into idolatry that like some of their punishment is like just they're completely gone. Now I don't know if they're like completely gone. You might be able to trace some of them back, but they basically kind of just fall out. Like even when you're looking at the Chronicles, which is supposedly was written by Ezra, right? He just completely leaves it out. It's a really interesting fact on that. So anyway, the consequences, right? Their disobedience, they're exiled, they intermarry. But you still realize, as I put up there, God is still in control. Okay, he's still in control out of all of this. All right, so even though Israel is taken into exile, God is still in charge. He knows what's happening. He's watching his people. He is allowing them to be punished because they're being disobedient. All right? And it is hopefully to bring them back eventually into, which many people, of course, when they read Romans, believe that there still is a place for Israel, like the actual nation of Israel, and that many of them will be saved at the end. So, in conclusion, did you have a question?
I just got it.
Oh, okay. Well, don't do it so high up. No. All right, so in conclusion, so this takes us to about, as I said, 722 BC, when Assyria conquers Israel and takes over Samaria. And so the next time we meet, whether that's in 2 weeks, unless the baby's born or something happens, right? We're going to discuss the history of Judah. We're going to start that, and we're going to see what happens to the southern kingdom. And so we're actually going to go back to 1 Kings. So this took us to 2 Kings 17, and there's still a couple more chapters after, because Judah lasts like another 140 years before they're taken over by Babylon. But we're going to go back to 1 Kings and start with Rehoboam, right, and kind of keep going with that and follow then the line of Judah. And they do still follow the line of David. Okay, so they don't really have as much. There's actually good kings in Judah. We'll just say it that way. There's actually good kings in Judah. So again, we ended 2 Kings 17 around 722 BC. And so, yeah, that's where Assyria conquers them, taken into exile. Next time, we're going to start talking about Judah. Any questions?
Just a comment might be good for a memory device because it's kind of hard to remember all this stuff, right? If you guys remember 722, 586. 722 is when the northern kingdom fell. 586 is when the southern kingdom fell. And then Assyria is who conquered the northern kingdom. They fell first. B, AB, and that's the Babylonians. So if you remember those two dates and AB, the Syrians, Babylonians, you'll keep the right order in your head. And there you got a thumbnail of Jewish history.
Short. So, all right. The last one, I typed in Samaria, and these are supposed to be pictures of Samaria. The bottom one obviously looks like they're ruins. The top one, I think, might be like in a national park of Samaria or something like that. I just typed it in with like, yeah, I know. I thought it looked like Zion, and at first I was like, did I type in the wrong thing? But on one of the pictures, it actually like showed a sign, and I think it said like National Park of Samaria. But supposedly this is some of what Samaria would have looked like. Which, like you said, the top part kind of looks like Zion actually, but really pretty. Really pretty.
The terrain is very similar to where
Yeah.
we live. So, you know, we're on the same, was that be longitude?
Something like, yeah.
As Israel. And so we have the same beauty, the same mountains that we look at. When you're there, you think you're looking at the same mountains. And they have, what's the name of the mountain, the tall one?
Which one?
No, the one where there's snow right now, this time of year.
Yeah, that one.
You know, where Moses,
Sinai?
no,
Mount Nebo? What is it?
That big one.
What is it? Not Gihon.
Let me look at the map. But anyway.
There's so many mountains over there.
There's mountains, there's
Mount
terrain,
Olives.
there's this rock, there are trees.
Sinai.
No, I don't wanna say that. No.
Not Gerizim. What is that one mountain?
It's that big mountain, the important one.
Big
The one
mountain.
that goes up towards Syria.
And wouldn't we be on the same latitude, not longitude as them?
I don't know. I thought latitude was like this and longitude was this.
So longitude.
But I've never been good at.
Which?
I've never really looked into that.
We're a lot like them.
We're in one of those lines. We're near one of those lines, whether latitude or longitude.
Needless to say, we're a lot like
That's right.
that area.
Exactly. We're very much like Israel. We keep falling away from God.
And we
That's
also,
what America
we
keeps
also
doing.
have our Sodom, which is called Las Vegas.
That's right.
I always consider that more New York.
What was that one? I missed that.
You know, it's really funny. So when you move to Las Vegas and you tell people you're moving to Las Vegas, right? They're like, oh, well, it's Sin City, and then it's like, yeah, and then you get here, and then you realize most of the people that like actually go to the casinos and stuff are from the people of those states coming to visit, and they're the ones that make it that way. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. It was really funny because you would hear that in Kansas City, and I'm like, you guys do realize you literally have your own gambling houses in Kansas City, right? You're talking bad about Las Vegas, but literally you cross the river and one of the first things you see is a casino, right? I'm like,
Riverboat gambling.
I just think it's really, really funny.
Yeah, the difference is they blush when you talk about prostitution.
Yes.
We don't.
We tax
Key
it.
West is really tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, longitude is long, it goes from north to south, and latitude is,
Okay, so we're on the same latitude.
yes.
Okay.
I like
I was
to tell
remembering
people-
longitude is long, and I was right, I had to look it up. Latitude is the only one that has.
I like to tell people, I go to conventions, and when I was the principal and spoke at a couple of them, I said, people tell you that Las Vegas is just like any other city. And I said, well, it is. It's like any other city that you go. You can work till 11 o'clock at night, go to the grocery store and shop, drop your last quarter in the slot machine as you go out, play a softball game at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you can gamble all night and still be a deacon in the Baptist church. So it's just like any other city.
Key West is really bad. When we lived down there in Key West, we had seances, and we had a parade, totally naked people, and bumper tracks on and going down there.
See, I think the difference is that Las Vegas, like, actually.
And put the blood on our church, and the deacons and the pastor was always cleaning up the church where the people had dead chickens on her.
Where is this?
In
Key West.
Florida.
Yeah. I think the difference is that Las Vegas actually promotes more what they're doing. And so it's out, it's like known for that. They're promoting it, yeah.
We profit off of sin. We're like the mob.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very recent in other parts of the country. It's just spread,
Yeah.
but this was the center of it.
I remember when I would go to Oklahoma, go to OU, when I'd travel from my house down, like my parents' house down in Burleson, up to Norman, which is just straight up I-35. The first thing you see, the first like main thing you see when you enter Oklahoma is, I think, the WinStar Casino. And then at the time, I don't know if it still exists, but if you're going the opposite way, the first building you see into Texas is an adult video store. And it just like,
It's shocking.
it was shocking. I was like, really? I was like, the first thing you see entering Oklahoma is a casino, and then the first thing you see when going into Texas is an adult video store. I was like, this can't be a good thing.
No.
I'm like, this is not good. But yeah.
The common
Anyway.
denominator is both those interstates end with a 5. Is that it?
And in a 5.
The common
35 and
denominator,
15.
the common denominator is the sin that is spread across the
Right,
world.
yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Common denominator.
So
They all need Jesus.
exactly. So, all right. Would someone like to close us out in prayer? Sam.
Sure. Father, we just thank you